Hello. Today we are discussing Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. This is very much an overview without too many details about specific philosophies. We want to consider sort of the influence each group had on the next group and on subsequent eras. So let's get started. So pre-Socratic philosophy is typically studied in preparation to understand Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Pre-Socratics, of course, this is a word coined in the 19th century, but it describes the philosophers living before and during the life of Socrates, and these philosophers influenced Socrates. From the pre-Socratic philosophers, we don't have any surviving texts, nothing in total. They're typically called natural philosophers because what we do have of their writings show that they covered theories about nature and physics. The list of pre-Socratic philosophers includes Thales, Anaximander, Anaximenes, Pythagoras, Xenophanes, Parmenides, Heraclitus, Zeno, Empedocles, Anaxagoras, Leucippus and Democritus, and Diogenes. The parentheses next to each name just quickly shows their theory of what the world is made out of or whatever their main theory was. Some of these thinkers in the pre-Socratic circles are not necessarily philosophers, but rather what we called sophists, what the ancients called sophists. This includes Protagoras, Gorgias, Hippias, Prodicus, and Antiphon. These sophists cover different topics than philosophers. They tend to cover things that have to do with the social world, and they tend to focus on the art of argumentation or rhetoric. There are additional thinkers from this era for whom we have very little testimony. One example would be Epimenides. A lot of the information about these philosophers comes from the Roman writer Diogenes Laertius, who wrote Lives of the Philosophers. Otherwise, we understand what some of their theories were because we have either fragments of their work or people like Aristotle, Plato, or whomever has quoted them. So we say with the pre-Socratics that we only have a fragments tradition. The questions that these guys asked concerned the fundamental nature or the fundamental laws of nature, what the world was made out of, what its particles were, what the laws were that governed particles, or more importantly, change and material and why it changes, things like growth, generation, death, movement. Another thing that these philosophers tackled was the gods and goddesses and put a rational spin on these sort of ideas. These pre-Socratics typically worked in a world of magic and religion and medicine in addition to philosophy. They tended to be experts in these sort of occult practices. A lot of times what they're doing is rationalizing and sort of like figuring out what in the practices actually works and why it works. So these thinkers embraced ideas like the study of physics and mathematics, logic and rhetoric, nature, animals, humans and medicine, plants and the drugs, right, that they would use from the plants, social topics, government, and ethics. Right, as I said, we have almost nothing from these writers. Most is lost. During their time of thinking, and a lot of these people traveled around Greece, being hired to teach and to give talks. But the idea of writing scrolls and books is just a word used to simplify here. They're really papyrus scrolls. The whole idea of a book industry is pretty minimal during this time. And we see more mention of books that you might buy or have copied during the time of Plato and Aristotle, but even then, the collecting of books was somewhat rare. In the Hellenistic times, after Aristotle, there would be a lot more time and attention dedicated to building libraries by governments, because at that point, knowledge had proved itself to be very powerful. So, because when these pre-Socratics wrote, there wasn't a very robust book tradition, we just have very little from them, mostly people quoting them or something in a fragment state. So, these folks are the ones who influenced Socrates. Let's now talk about what we know about Socrates. For Socrates, we're talking about a very famous Athenian man who was born and died in Athens. He died, of course, from being found guilty in a court case and sentenced to death. He is given credit as the founder of Western philosophy. And what we don't know much about him. So what we do know about him is that he specialized in moral and ethical philosophy, like how one ought to live their life, what is the right thing to do. But there's more depth than just those few questions. We know Socrates through his students, Plato and Xenophon, for instance, as well as Aristotle, who was not a student, but knew a lot about him. So Socrates was very famous in Athens. He himself never founded a school, nor was he an official teacher. He was known to informally teach students around the gymnasium, which was a place for education and exercise and all sorts of things, in classical Athens. Socrates was famous enough to where Aristophanes, the comic poet, wrote and performed a comedy about him in 423 BCE, right, at the city Dionysia, which was a festival in honor of Dionysus, where tragedy and comedy were performed. So, of course, the comedy makes fun of Socrates and his sort of mindset, but this just goes to show you that Socrates was pretty famous if, his character and characterization was put on stage. All right, Socrates served in the Athenian military. He fought several major battles in the Peloponnesian War. This is the long war between Athens and Sparta. And when this war ended, Sparta won ultimately, and it was shortly after Athens lost that Socrates was tried and sentenced to death. It is thought that some of the things going on with Socrates, his students, and things like that led to his charges of impiety, that his trial was politically motivated. And it's very likely has to do with the action of some of Socrates' students like Alcibiades and some of Plato's associates like Critias. There was a lot of different people that may have played been on the wrong side of history, as it were, at the end of the Peloponnesian War. He was officially charged with corrupting the youth and for impiety, which is like not believing in the same gods as the city. He was found guilty in the trial, after the trial, sentenced to death. As I said, his court case was definitely politically motivated. His trial and defense speech is described by Plato in his Apology and by Xenophon in his Apology. So we have two accounts of this trial. Once Socrates was found guilty and sentenced, then he, as we see in the dialogues of Plato, he had an attempt or the opportunity to escape his punishment and just go into exile. And he chose not to do that. And he chose to drink the hemlock and die. And, this is part of his mythology and story. Of course, not mythology in that it didn't happen, because it did happen, but mythology in that Socrates was legendary. And he went out this way instead of going into exile. All right. Of course, for Socrates, since he didn't write any books and we only really have indirect accounts of his life, we don't really know much about the real Socrates. except that, he existed, fought in these battles, and was tried and was famous enough to be the subject of a comedy. Um, all of the secondhand accounts of Socrates do not agree about the man and his thoughts. This is called in scholarship and academia the Socratic problem, that we don't have much knowledge of the historical Socrates. And what we do have is the Socrates presented in Plato and Xenophon, by Aristophanes, and other places. So we don't really know who the real Socrates is. It's mostly through reading Plato and his dialogues, understand that his dialogues feature Socrates as a character, the main character, that we know anything about Socrates. So there are some things that scholars feel comfortable saying, right, about Socrates' method, which then Plato uses, right? And that method is the dialectic or the dialogue. So the Socratic method, the so-called dialectic or Socratic dialogue, it sort of starts from this idea that all that I know is that I know nothing. It starts with sort of an idea that we don't know what's going on. And then through a dialogue of people asking questions, and those questions and answers being applied to rigorous logic, right? Ultimately, a question is sort of addressed. But as they address questions in a dialogue, like what is knowledge, what is justice, they don't tend to answer or really set up a system to tackle, right? Rather, these dialogues typically end with the idea that the participants, including the speaker, Socrates, doesn't really understand enough about it, and that we are thus limited, right? And this sort of becomes a very famous definition of philosophy, that philosophy looks for the limits of knowledge to understand where we are short-sighted and to see what the consequence of that is. In a Socratic dialogue, people answer questions, right? Here's in these examples, Socrates would be the main speaker and people would answer questions that he poses. And then through the unpacking of those questions and answers, the participants realize that the questions are really quite difficult to answer. And with this kind of enlightenment, where you realize that we don't know enough about it to fully answer it, it also leads to a lot of like paradoxes in life, right? This is called traditionally Socratic irony, right? Paradoxes that show that there is sort of a misconnect between what is the world and how we perceive the world, right? And so this is part of coming to a better understanding. It might sound like a simple problem, but through this sort of paradox, we get the need and ultimately the invention of scientific method and instruments for measuring, right? Because the eyes at the end of the day don't perceive atoms, and so rather instruments perceive atoms and mathematical systems account for atoms, right? So it's this understanding that we need to have a better approach at tackling big questions that leads us to better solutions. So the idea that human mind, human perception limited, is supposed to lead us to the next level. Of course, for Socrates, we hear that what he really talked about a lot was epistemology and ethics. See this a bit in the Apology, that is, how do people know the truth? Are they sure about that truth? Can they validate that truth, right? Or do they just hold an opinion about truth, right? So how do we know truth, or how do we know anything is true for that matter? The real versus the false. But it becomes, of course, an ethical question because we ask ourselves, knowing these limits, how are we supposed to live? What is the right way to live? Because in Socrates' assumption and opinion, people tended to be very kind of arrogant about knowledge, assuming they knew everything when they didn't really know much. And it's not so much to be mean. He's not trying to point out people are dumb. Socrates is trying to point out that it's socialization and custom to pretend like you know things, but that society ought to move into a mode of actually knowing things so they can benefit from that knowledge. This, of course, is something that we would see in the reinvention of Socrates and Plato and the, move towards modern day science. So Socrates is concerned that people just assume they have answers, know the truth without really being trained or a specialist. Those are the kind of things that concerned him. That someone that knew how to train horses also pretended like they knew a lot about farming. Knowing about one thing doesn't make you knowledgeable in another. More importantly, he points out that people that know a lot about farming and horses then pretend they know a lot about government. And he points out that that's a major fail. So, he kind of felt like society was opinionated and had consequences, but wasn't very much concerned with real truth. At the same time, we get our Socrates through Plato, so we're not really sure what the real Socrates thought and said, right? We only know, again, from reading all of Plato, seeing what Aristotle said about Socrates, reading Xenophon's version of Plato, and sort of putting together all the stories. And it doesn't really come out as the coherent whole. But anyways, from Socrates, definitely a tradition was established, the dialectic method, as a way of teasing out the truth of things through question and answer, where the questions are perplexing, not like a reading quiz, but more like difficult questions, like what is knowledge? How do we know when we have figured out what is knowledge? What will be that moment? How would we say we now understand the concept? And does knowing knowledge mean we know what is true or false? It's a difficult question. So in the dialectic method, typically a lot of questions are asked until no further questions or no further answers can be provided because the crowd is out of answers. All knowledge then has a limit to its truth. And so philosophy looks to that limit. It's important. All right, so that is Socrates. We now consider Plato. Of course, we have a lot more from Plato, a lot of writings, but then Plato uses Socrates as his character. So if you can imagine this sort of interesting history, we don't know much about Plato, right? Because in terms of his writings, he mostly is talking about Socrates. So let's get into the details of this. Of course, Plato was born and died in Athens, and he was born to a wealthy family. He was a student of Socrates, and by age 40, he established his own school of philosophy. This was called the Academy. It's called the Academy because it was located in the sacred grove of an Olympic victor. This guy's name was Academos, or also in the Greek, you would say Hecademos. The Academy, of course, was a very famous school and was in operation until 84 BCE when the Roman consul Sulla destroyed it. Rome conquered Greece a few times because of political tension between Greece, Macedon, and Mithridates. But of course, that's not even a penny of Plato's influence. His school is just one element of it. Aristotle studied at the school of Plato. And of course, Plato is considered, through his dialogues, one of the major branches of thought in philosophy. Platonism, and sometimes understood Neoplatonism when Plato was sort of re-embraced in various times. We have some news of Plato recently because of these papyrus scrolls found in the city of Herculaneum in the Bay of Naples in Italy. If you know the story of Herculaneum and Pompeii, the cities were destroyed in the Common Era around 70 by a volcano. And a lot of the remains of Herculaneum and Pompeii are in like pristine condition because they were covered in volcanic ash. The library in Herculaneum is like that, except the papyrus scrolls there were burnt. But new technology has learned how to read those scrolls. And we got recent news about Plato from sometime closer to his real life, not too close, but closer than we are now. There had always been accounts that Plato was sold into slavery in 387. This is not uncommon in the Greek world, a type of punishment, and it's sort of like citizens were protected in their own cities. But if they left their city and the people in the next city did not like them, then they could disenfranchise them. Plato evidently, in this account where he sold into slavery for trying to overthrow the tyrant of Syracuse, right? He was meddling in the politics in Sicily. We have very little to corroborate this. Mostly comes from a letter attributed to Plato, which has been found and thought to be spurious. But there has always been the story that Plato was sold into slavery. And then, of course, his students bought him out of slavery, which was a common practice in the ancient Greek world. You could buy someone out. And the Greeks typically, if they conquered somebody, a group, they would enslave those people they conquered, even if they were Greeks. And so it's not uncommon that the Greeks would enslave Greeks as a form of punishment. But from this ruins of Herculaneum, from the library there, these recovered papyrus scrolls, we now have some new information, and it seems that there's a writing in Herculaneum called the History of the Academy, which we've never had access to. It was a lost document. But now through reconstruction, we've learned that it's possible that Plato was sold into slavery not in the Syracusean event, but much earlier, right, when Sparta conquered the island of Aegina during the Peloponnesian War. That context would fit a little bit better because Sparta would take the Athenians that it wasn't going to kill and sell them into slavery. That would put him, and then of course it's still the story is the same that his friends freed him. And then that same author from the charred papyrus also says that another story existed that he was sold into slavery after Socrates was put to death. It's just interesting to know, but Plato, of course, died as a freedman, and as far as we know, natural causes. So the thing about the Sicily or Syracusean event is that it's thought that Plato believed deeply in these ideas of government that he writes about in the Republic and the laws, and that he was going to set up this very kind of government in Sicily by having the tyrant's brother overthrow him. The current tyrant. Tyrants were a pretty common feature in, classical and post-classical Greek cities. They're typically oligarchs that have taken charge and sort of turned the government into like a namesake. So it's pretty common stuff. For Plato, we have trouble saying, what Plato thought versus Socrates. In fact, some lectures could just say Plato-Socrates, since they're just one text that is a series of dialogues. Socrates is the speaker, Plato is the writer, and it's impossible to know where to attribute the idea. It may not be necessary for us to know. What we see in the Platonic dialogues is that Socrates and Plato were deeply influenced by what we call the pre-Socratics, like Heraclitus, Parmenides, Zeno, and Pythagoras. We have 35 dialogues attributed to Plato, and not all of them, of course, are considered written by him. Some of them are spurious or dubious. But if we want to understand a Platonic dialogue, we should see that each dialogue, right, covers sort of a set of topics or one topic, and we'll just continue asking questions around that topic for the dialogue. For a lot of Plato's dialogues, the topic, like what is knowledge, what is justice, are never really solved. Instead, it is just the dialogue leaves with this idea that they don't know and we have no answer. The theaetetus comes to mind. So understanding that each dialogue typically surrounds an idea and a question, we can sort of look at a couple here without getting too many details, right? This is just a handful of dialogues from Plato. The Timaeus, right, is this a very interesting dialogue. It talks about cosmology and cosmogony, the creation of the universe, the four elements of the universe. It speculates a fifth element of the universe, right? It talks about physics and motion and change. Also talks about the creation of humans beyond the creation of the universe. And what's interesting about the Timaeus is the speaker gives most of the credit to the Egyptians who have been around forever and really know how the world works. So it's interesting. Timaeus gives us a lot of insight into how the Greeks saw knowledge. They saw the Egyptians as these specialists. And so I'm sure we're already aware that the ancient philosophers thought there were particles, atoms or elements, and they had their own systemization of those elements, breaking them into four types with their own different kind of causation. The Theaetetus is another dialogue by Plato. It's a very interesting dialogue that covers the question, what is knowledge? What is true and false? How do we know true and false? And what is perception? Again, in that dialogue, very little is concluded. Most students have heard of the Republic of Plato and typically have read this in college, right? Republic is very famous, and it's a very long dialogue. It covers a lot of information. And it could take, if you're really studying the dialogue, take a few months to actually just read it and unpack it. Its main topic is what is justice? And just like Theaetetus, the secondary questions, how will we know what is justice? Can we truly prove this is justice or that? What is justice? It devolves into a discussion of what is the ideal government, because it's understood that a government might be used to ensure justice. And then additionally, it asks how one should live their life. Of course, the Republic is famous for describing an ideal government, a utopia, as they call them. So it's always been, discussed and debated as to whether the government that the Republic puts forward has any, is valid or has any, usefulness. Of course, the government itself is very hypothetical, and it's supposed to be a description that helps us locate justice in the soul of humans. So another part of the Republic is covering the soul. And the Republic has very famous sections, may have heard of them, like the allegory of the cave, the analogy of the divided line, the myth of the three-parted soul, and the highest good. These are all ideas that come out of the Republic and have been debated and discussed for eons. All right, the Ion is another dialogue. It's much shorter than the Republic. It covers like what is musical performance, which the dialogue concludes. Musical performance is where the gods inspire the singer. All right, you can see now that not every dialogue is as robust as the other. Phaedrus is an interesting dialogue. It discusses what is the human soul, what is love, and what is philosophy. The Meno covers the topic, what is learning? What does it mean for one to learn? Plato had this idea that people did not learn, but rather they remembered what they had forgotten in their previous death. All right, the Symposium covers the idea of what is love. That's an erotic love, of course. And then these last four surround the trial and death of Socrates. And again, there's more dialogues in this, and the order here has very little to do with anything. They're not ordered here in any way. We're still discussing or debating, which came first, which dialogue is early, middle, or late. But the Euthyphro, Apology, Credo, and Phaedo all surround the trial and death of Socrates. So the Euthyphro is Socrates going to the trial, like on his way. Sorry, he's on his way to answer the trial. If you got sued, you would have to go to the law court and then promise to be there for the trial. Socrates could have just skipped out. This is absolutely true, and he didn't. Um, so the Euthyphro is he's going to the courthouse to basically say he'll be in court on the day he's been called, and he runs into Euthyphro, who's also at the courthouse and is, filing a lawsuit against his own father for murder. But anyways, the two of them have a great conversation trying to figure out what is piety. This is the very thing that Socrates was tried for, that is impiety, not being pious. So Socrates asks Euthyphro to define piety. Of course, Euthyphro can't do it. And Socrates' point at the end is that, he's going to go to trial and face a death sentence over something that people can't define, right? And that's very Socratic. That's very much what I mean by he has an epistemological approach, what is true and false, and it's mixed with an ethical approach, right? If you don't know what impiety is, how could you try someone and then kill them for being impious, right? And this is Socrates' point. Society has beliefs and they can be very dangerous. Anyways, Socrates goes to his trial, and that is accounted for in the Apology. He is found guilty. Um, it's a very interesting dialogue, and we don't have time to cover it right here, but it reveals a lot about Socrates' mindset in this trial. He doesn't seem to try and win it. He sort of knows that he's already lost. Anyways, the Credo occurs after the trial when Socrates is in prison. An ancient prison is a holding cell awaiting for you to be moved either to, exile or to face capital punishment. So Socrates was in sort of a holding cell, and his students come, specifically Credo, to bail him out, to get him to run away, and he refuses. And they have a dialogue about what is the opinion of the many or public opinion, and whether one should listen to public opinion or rather make their own decisions. Of course, Socrates drinks the potion, the hemlock, and describes the entire experience of death in the Phaedo. Right, so those are just a few dialogues. Of course, just describing their basic topics will not do them justice. They will not help us understand how Plato is, a founder of the philosophical tradition. We would have to rather study these dialogues in great detail because as you go through them, tons and tons of questions and ideas come forth that do indeed make up the fundamentals of philosophy. All right, but we're here today to just have a very general overview. So Plato wrote these dialogues. These are not books of philosophy, they're dialogues. So we might ask, did he write any books about philosophy, like this is a book on philosophy? If he did, we don't have them, right? And he gave lectures at the academy, but we don't have his lectures, not even someone who took notes on his lectures. So we only have his dialogues. We do not have his lectures. We do not have any kind of books he wrote that were not a dialogue, right? So we don't know what Plato really thought. Um, People have always tried to see a system in the dialogues, right? A system meaning that his philosophy has different parts that work in harmony and explain all things. That's a system, right? We think of Newtonian physics as a systematic physics that explains the movement of all things. You might say, well, it actually doesn't explain the movement of all things. Yeah, well, systems have their limits. And we have to wonder in the first place whether a system is being built or if someone's just speculating on different ideas that do not come together into a system. So we don't really see a systematic theory in the dialogues, and we're not sure if whether Plato had one. If it was systematic, it would mean that his idea applied to every instance, was universal. Over the eons of reception of Plato, there has been a system read into Plato where scholars say this is his philosophical system. And they typically point to the things that I just write here, like theory of forms and the divided line. Too complicated to explain in one or two sentences, typically simplified as, oh, problems with universals, problems with categorical logic. But that's too simple. The theory of forms, of course, postulates this idea that if we draw a circle, then shouldn't there be this idea of a circle? And if there is, where does that idea exist? Where does that idea of a circle come from? And is that idea of a circle internal, right? And many more questions. And if you really start to break it down, you realize that, you know, if these forms really exist, we're enmeshed in an entire world that the forms provide. Of course, the forms, in the sense, would be a non-material kind of item. The divided line is a further understanding of forms that you have the reality you touch and then the reality that you think, and that thinking isn't material, and thus the world is sort of divided between what you think about, what you dream about, then what you see in real life and what is actually real, right? You might see a rock, but the real rock might be made up of all sorts of substances, right? Leading someone from mental to physical to ultimately a truth. Now, these are, quick summaries of the forums is not going to do it any justice. But throughout the dialogues, you see this topic come up a lot. How do we define something, and is that definition universal, and is it all binding, and when is it not binding? All right, also from the Republic, and again, the works of Plato, we always hear of the allegory of the cave, this idea that humans live in sort of a world of darkness, and that through philosophy, thinking, and questioning, they move towards an enlightenment. Although that enlightenment is very bright, it's hard to see. It requires time in the cave. Once someone has reached enlightenment and they see the world for what it is, when they go back to their friends who still live in darkness, they are unsuccessful trying to wake them up. So it's this understanding that truth is a difficult path and that most people aren't looking for truth. Otherwise, again, in the Republic, we hear the myth of which is an interesting story of afterlife and reincarnation. But Plato is known for much more than just the myth of in a dialogue like the Theaetetus, he discusses a lot this idea of non-material and non-material causes. Again, we don't have time to really cover this in total, but non-material is an attempt to cover things that have no atomic mass or material existence. For instance, numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 are non-material. So the equation 1 plus 1 equals 2 is a non-material. You can't touch it, you can't weigh it, has no mass, right? Yet it seems to be infinitely true, true in all times and places. This is something very interesting that causes, of course, the uncovering of the world great problems because we're really stuck with material. Again, not enough time to give it much justice, the topic that is, but non-material is a pretty big thing that Plato felt people were not considering. And once you start to consider everything in the world that is non-material, it becomes apparent that like half the world is non-material that we participate in. For instance, your eyes see something, but perception, the thing that comes together in your brain, perception is a non-material, so is knowledge. All right, Plato also had a lot to say about what is the soul. And again, we'll talk in a moment about his reception. Let's move to Aristotle, right? By reception, of course, I mean that when Plato died, his philosophy kept going. When his school was closed, his philosophy kept going through his students. Basically, Platonism made up a fourth or a fifth of Roman philosophical schools. We'll talk more about it. So our other big thinker, right, Socrates, Plato, now Aristotle. Aristotle, right, is the youngest of the group in terms of coming the latest, right? Um, he is not born and raised in Athens. He was actually born up by Macedon or Macedonia. Macedonia was an independent kingdom to the north of Athens, always shared neighbors and culture with Athens, but the Macedonians were different folk, had different ideas, and weren't always in unison with the Greeks. They loved the idea of trying to use Greek ideas for themselves, for their own benefit. So Aristotle was born in Stagira, which is near Thessalonia, which is near Macedon, which means he was more exposed to those cultures growing up. His parents died when he was young. His father, according to the myths, was a doctor to the Macedonians. But anyways, when Aristotle was 17 or 18, he went to Athens and joined Plato's academy. He did have like foster parents. And he studied at Plato's Academy until, as we understand it, he was about 37 years old. After his time at the Academy, Aristotle went to Macedon and was a tutor to the children of King Philip II, his children, Alexander, Ptolemy, and Cassander. Aristotle taught these kiddos, and all of these guys, Alexander, Ptolemy, and Cassander, would have immense influence over history, right? So Aristotle taught these guys, and these guys went on to like basically change the world. And because Aristotle tutored these guys, um, their world changed with with a kind of Aristotle spirit. We'll talk a little bit more about that. For now, we just want to be aware that Alexander the Great had immense influence over the Mediterranean areas, the cultures. We call his time the Hellenistic world. And this made philosophy and philosophical inquiry an extremely important topic in the Hellenistic and Roman worlds. So Alexander is very responsible for spreading these trends. All right, after Alexander leaves on his expedition, Aristotle goes back to Athens, and that's when he sets up his school, the Lyceum. Should just mention that the tradition around, like Aristotle's students, people in his school, they're called peripatetic, basically means to walk around and think. Aristotle's philosophy is not the same as Plato's. They cover the same topics, but Aristotle has forged his own way. And it has his own spirit of philosophy that's different than Plato. And these two different spirits of philosophy then defined major movements of philosophy through all of its ages. So it's like very interesting. Aristotle typically is thought to be more analytic, and Plato's philosophy tends to be more ideal, more thinking versus applying. All right, so Aristotle, different than Plato, Aristotle was very interested in the study and codification of everything in the world, plant, mineral, animal, whatever. Um, of course, his philosophy and the traditions that received his philosophy were extremely long-lived and influenced several movements, just like Plato. Aristotle is given credit for setting up all the basics of what would become science, what would become medicine as well. His lyceum, his school, had a library, so he sort of made it trendy to collect books and have books, and then had his students writing books. The Lyceum was a major study center until late antiquity, like the five or six hundreds Common Era. Anyways, it didn't go out of trend until Justinian was the emperor of Rome. So it stuck around for a while, and then this idea of codifying knowledge would become important to learning centers to, what are all the animals? What are all the plants? What are all the rocks? What are all the human illnesses, right? This idea of making data sets. That's what we mean by codifying in one instance. He thought, since we don't know all the answers, let's just collect all the data. And so, works from the Lyceum list all the plants, they list all the human ailments, they list all of the animals, and then tries to categorize them. All right, but much like Plato, we don't know enough about Aristotle's life, and his writings only so much help us. For instance, Aristotle wrote dialogues, but we don't have any of them, right? He wrote books, but we only have a handful. What we mostly have are his lecture notes, which were probably written by his students. Now, it doesn't mean we've lost Aristotle or what he said. It's pretty much understood that what his students wrote down was pretty darn close to what he said. Plus, we do have some books that are his to compare. And at the end of the day, we find a very consistent Aristotle. Whether his consistent systematic philosophy leads to truth is a different story. It definitely bore forth a lot of knowledge, right? And that question, though, of whether either of these philosophers built the ultimate system, no, neither of them did. But unlike Plato, Aristotle really wanted questions that could be answered. He recognized that questions could go without answer because they were too complicated. But through his sort of study of phenomena, he says, we have to start somewhere. We might want to start with what we know and sort of keep track of what is known. Right. So for major works by Aristotle, we have the physics, the metaphysics, the Nicomachean ethics, the politics, logic, on the soul, and the poetics. These are books that will just be all by themselves. They were full works and they are attributed to Aristotle. Of course, metaphysics was the book next to physics, right? Physics deals with how the nature works, but metaphysics asks the causes, right? What causes movement? It's supposed to be a different kind of approach. Nicomachean ethics is about individual personal ethics, how one should live their life. Politics is about government ethics and how economics should work. Logic is about the art of argumentation and how you find valid conclusions through syllogism, through logic, like categorical and hypothetical logic, how you find valid arguments. His book on the soul tries to understand the human body and what we would call the brain. For him, it's the soul. It's a work on psychiatry or psychology. And the poetics is more limited in scope. It's about what makes a good tragedy or comedy and what the audience, when they watch comedy and tragedy, what they feel. Now, interesting enough, if you look to a medieval or an ancient Roman version of Aristotle, you'll typically come into this word, the organon, which means instrument. And it's a collection of books by Aristotle, but they're not the ones I just listed. They're rather this other line here, generation of plants and animals, zoology, generation, and things like that. So there was sort of different ways to canonize Aristotle, to collect his works and study them. All right, so in different, unlike Plato, Aristotle sort of got this idea going where people would study plants and animals and biology, classify everything under the world into categories and start to figure out what is common, right? Are fish and humans the same? Well, no, Aristotle would recognize that fish breathe underwater, humans breathe air or something else, right? And the point being is that later when science was being born, you think, oh, wait, these are mammals, right? And these are, reptiles, and these are birds, right? You start to get the kingdoms and all this classification. Very much an Aristotelian idea started much earlier. In Aristotle's writings, like the Physics and Metaphysics, we hear about the four causes that cause any kind of movement, change, generation. The four elements, the things that can be manipulated by nature, right? Sort of an early atomic theory. And of course, he speculates on a fifth element. If we understand the four elements, it's air, fire, water, um, and earth. And, fire and wind are not elements, they're process. So you could already see that their approach to atoms needed some work, which is fine. We actually wouldn't really understand atoms until the 1800s. It's in the 1800s where the period of table, the period of elements appears and is completely sort of finished in the mid 1800s. Common era. So it took humans a long time to understand atoms and atomic theory. For the ancient world, the four elements, two of them are processes. But it's still through their attempt at understanding the world is, allow the next generation and future generations to ultimately solve the equation. Aristotle, of course, is concerned as to what causes motion, what causes change. Also, you have a substance, right, material, but you also have an essence, all these things, all these laws that maybe are associated with the material, sort of like how inside of a seed, you have the potential for a plant, but then you have to grow the seed to get that plant. Well, this made Aristotle think about things like potential, what's inside, versus actual, what you can see, right? The essence and the potential are very much like Plato's forms. They're non-material ideas that we have to assume, right? So if we have, a piece of metal, we know its melting point. We know we know what it takes to break that metal or to manipulate that metal, right? We know its properties, and those properties are what? Where are they? It's just trial and error. The ancients would try and figure out what are these properties and where do they exist? Anyways, tricky stuff. All right, so potential versus actual. And then, of course, he had a lot of practical questions like how does the human body work? How does human medicine work? How do animals' bodies work? How do plants work? And minerals. Also, he wanted to understand the clouds, weather formation, seasons, and that includes the planets and the stars, what we call astronomy, right? He very much looks like proto-science, right? Whereas when you look at Plato, he has a lot of mathematics and a lot of really intense, um, big question topics. You know, Aristotle does ask those things, but he's less concerned with the inability to answer and more concerned with trying to categorize everything. Anyways, just like Plato, Aristotle also wrote about ethics, how one should live their life, and he thought that the point of human life was to better oneself, to make oneself a better and more efficient human every day. Of course, his works on politics and economics were very famous, and he really spearheaded these kind of studies. Most of all, as we talk a little bit more about Alexander the Great, Aristotle's philosophy became very popular and famous during the Hellenistic world, the world of Alexander the Great. And accordingly, he was fully embraced at all of the different Hellenistic institutions. Plato was as well. But Aristotle, like Hellenistic science, is the closest we will ever see to a development of a scientific method and a practice of science before the Roman Dark Ages, right? So it's kind of important. It's this small period of time when kings like Ptolemy would pay someone like Archimedes to write books about science, right? Archimedes, of course, was from Sicily. He figured out water displacement. We would hope that would have helped us understand gravity, but that did not. But it did help us understand that you could weigh things right, by putting them in water and looking at how the water displaces. This means that Archimedes was starting to deal with the equations of mass and the understanding of mass, right? Of course, it would still be Newton much later, right, in the 1600s that would make a system of science, but natural laws explaining what these ancients were trying to explain. But Aristotle, in his scientific approach, became very popular during the Hellenistic times, and a lot of knowledge. One type that comes to mind is medicine. A lot of knowledge came out of places like Alexandria. It was during the Hellenistic era that some of these doctors in Alexandria, figured out the major systems of the body, the circulatory, the the muscle system, the nervous system, also like the pulmonary system, right? It's during that time when they really started to put all their minds together and figure the stuff out. It doesn't mean that we see modern day science in Hellenistic world. All right, this whole Hellenistic world is just important because this was all a part of Alexander the Great. So when Alexander the Great went on his expedition, he never made it back. He died in Babylon on his way back. Um, and all of his relatives, his brothers and advisors, they took over the places that he had conquered and they ran those places like Turkey and Egypt, right, in the spirit of Alexander. For Athens, this was kind of a nightmare because of Alexander the Great and because of Macedon, Athens and most of Greece had lost its independence. And so Athenians really were mad about this. And when the fall of Athens occurred and Athens became part of Macedon, Aristotle, of course, was tried on impiety and he left the city. His schools, though, functioned still, and Theophrastus took over the school after Aristotle. And Theophrastus, of course, we have all of his writings. He tried and made a very good attempt at codifying plants, inventing basically the study of botany, which includes medicine and farming and all sorts of interesting things. So Alexander the Great has a lot of influence in the story of ancient philosophy. Before we talk about him for a few more minutes, let's just mention that when Aristotle left Athens, you know, there were, of course, his own school, the Lyceum, Plato's school, the Academy, and you had several other philosophy schools functioning, the Stoics, the Epicureans, the Cynics, and then just overall you had Pythagoreans and the Hippocratic medicine was considered a type of philosophy. Its four humors matched up to the four elements, right? So you have a lot of other philosophies. We're not talking so much about Stoicism, Epicureanism, Cynicism, etc. We know that Plato was influenced by Pythagoras and that there's a pretty heavy dose of Pythagoreanism in Plato. Pythagoras thought that numbers were very important, that numbers might lead us to understand and demystify the world, that numbers also worked in harmony, and these sort of things. Pythagoras, of course, preached mathematics, geometry, and number theory, and was very influential because a lot of what he talks about is harmony. And that's harmony in music or just harmony in nature. Um, Anyways, the Stoics have their own mindset. Stoic philosophy set up by Zeno. Epicureanism is another interesting philosophy, very scientifically minded, where we have to figure out the rules of nature, and it's not really, nature is not really run by the gods and goddesses. So these were other, districts or schools of philosophy in Plato and Aristotle time. All of these sort of schools would last into the Roman era. All right, we've mentioned Alexander the Great a lot. We should just say a few more things about him, right? That basically he died when he was 33. He had conquered a lot of places at that time. Mostly he didn't want to go home. That's why he just stayed out on a long campaign. But Greece lost its freedom, right? Greece was broken up into all of these independent city-states that had their own governments. Of course, it fell to Macedon in 338, Battle of Chaeronea, and what is also called the Fall of Thebes. Alexander was the general, and then his father Philip would die shortly thereafter. Then Alexander would be the king. Um, as a king, there was a lot of politics and drama in the Macedonian court. He would just probably be killed sooner or later by other people who wanted to be king. So he chose to go to Asia Minor and conquer the Persians. And this was a very long campaign, had hundreds of thousands of people accompanying him. He made it, I mean, he conquered Turkey, he conquered the coast of Judea, he conquered Egypt, he conquered the entirety of the Middle East, he conquered Afghanistan, and then he went and conquered a small slither of India. And basically for his time period, the 300s, I mean, India was the farthest anybody could even fathom. I mean, that was like the edge of the world. As we mentioned, Aristotle was Alexander's tutor. So Alexander loved everything ancient Greek, or Greek for him, not ancient, only ancient to us. But he loved everything Greek. He had all these people in his entourage who would write poetry and philosophy and history and perform tragedy. Um, he like thought of himself as this authentic Greek. Alexander thought that he was a son of Zeus and that he was a brother of Hercules. Anyways, we're not here to determine Alexander's status. Legendary guy, though, all the same. His relatives took over the land after he died, like Egypt. Egypt can be our example. The Ptolemies took over Egypt. And because they're very Alexander in spirit, and because Ptolemy himself was a student of Aristotle, Ptolemy paid all these scholars to come together. He formed the Library of Alexandria and the learning institution called the Museum. And they had a huge collection of scrolls. They had scholars in resident. It wasn't it was a school, but not quite, we would think of it that way. A lot of professors who had residents then had their students, but there wasn't like a degree program. It's just a place of learning. The library contained all the scrolls known to human at the time. It's a massive library. And all of these things would turn into codified knowledge. In particular, Ptolemy would promote the writing of science, so he would pay for it, right? This didn't exactly turn into a scientific world, but it was a big step in the right direction. And under Ptolemy's Egypt, we see advances in medicine, physics, etc., and even new inventions for human life. All right, now the world of Alexander the Great and the Hellenistic world would be overshadowed by the Roman world. Rome, a whole different story in a different place, Italy, not Greece, would have its own history. Of course, they had philosophy too, but they would ultimately embrace the Greek kind and the Greek mentality, right? So the Roman world loved everything Greek, just like the Hellenistic world. And so philosophy would find its home in Rome. all the philosophers we talked about. Now, this we're going to simplify just to give us a very brief understanding. There's really too much knowledge here to try and cover it all in one lecture, the reception of Plato and Aristotle, but we're just looking at the basics. We now understand why Alexander the Great was important. It's really the world that he left behind that had such an influence on Europe. All right, but in the Roman world, you had the embracement of Plato and Aristotle. For Plato, that was called Platonism. And then in the Roman Empire, you have Neoplatonism, which is like a new embracement. You had Aristotle philosophy, which was called Peripatetic. And you had these other schools I had mentioned, like Stoicism, Epicureanism, Cynicism, and there's also skepticism. Romans enjoyed philosophy schools, although they were deeply religious. They practiced all the government religion, they practiced all their personal religion. But a lot of Romans also subscribed to philosophy schools, and many of them, including women, attended philosophy schools where they would be taught, how to live the best life, how to like be successful, and what to speculate upon. So the Roman world was very motivated by philosophy, and people who went to school would study philosophy. There was also a very heavy dose of philosophy in medicine. That is, Rome had a very robust medical world, a lot of places where they taught it, learned it, and wrote about it. And in the medical writings of Rome, you will see a lot of discussion of philosophy, in which philosophers had the correct version and understanding of like human biology. So in the Roman world, these traditions continue on and become very important. We can think of the famous Roman senator and the advisor of Emperor Nero. His name was Seneca. He was a Stoic. And in his time, a lot of the intellectuals in the first century Common Era, the intellectuals in the Roman Empire embraced this Stoic idea, which very much rejected the traditional gods and looked for natural explanations for how the world worked. And it was all supposed to be a way of life. If you know the story of Roman Empire, though, ultimately Roman Empire would become Christian around the 300s. And it's at that time that we get the emergence of Neoplatonism, and of course, peripatetic philosophy is still around. But Rome, as an empire, was very reliant on philosophy. The government employed teachers and philosophers in all of its big cities. When it turned Christian, the government turned Christian and its schools turned Christian, and the philosophers didn't go away. The philosophers all turned Christian and synthesized Plato and Aristotle into the Christianity. And we have a few examples here on the Platonic side. This guy Plotinus, he, writing in the 400s, well, 300s, fourth century, right? He's called a Neoplatonist, but he was also synthesizing Pythagorean theory and Christian philosophy all into one. Um, a lot of people were embracing Christianity, and synthesizing philosophy into Christianity got everyone on board. That's sort of how St. Augustine got into Christianity. He was a Neoplatonist and Christian philosopher, ultimately becomes a church father and a major authoritarian in the Catholic Church, right? But all of these, we call them church fathers, or they were bishops, or they worked in the Christian government. All of them synthesized philosophy with Christian theology and sort of made this new idea. Now, if you go deeper and deeper in the late antiquity of Rome, the Roman Empire, we know that the empire falls. Of course, on the eastern side, called Byzantium, that side of the empire lasts until the 1400s, Common Era, whereas the Western Empire falls, in like what, 476, Common Era. Although all the Roman stuff still goes on in the West, it just becomes more Gothic and Christian. Over time, in late antiquity, everything dealing with Rome or Greece, what they call pagan, was banned and subversive. Plato was definitely banned in late antiquity. His philosophies were not considered useful. Aristotle kind of survived all of this, though, because Aristotle became the new darling of Christian theology moving into the Middle Ages. Of course, the Christian version of Aristotle doesn't care about categorizing animals and plants. It doesn't care about practicing science. It instead wants to approach the system of God and Christ and the Holy Father and Christian ethics and the right way to live and what is salvation. So Aristotle survived into the Middle Ages, but his philosophy looked nothing like what we see in classical Greece. In fact, they call it scholasticism, which is your medieval Aristotle, basically his philosophy being used to inform Christian dogma, which is just a fancy word for their theology. Dogma would be like their beliefs. We could see an easy example of the synthesis with Aristotle and Christian dogma in the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas, his Summa Theologica. Right. And so, of course, the way the Christian world worked is that theologians, people that knew all the writings and all the teachings, would sort of explain, what the right way to practice the religion was. And since this religion was centrally located in the Vatican, right, the what we call the papal church, the papacy was in charge with their papal law based on Aristotle, what people could do, what people couldn't do. So that's sort of a bizarre place for philosophy to live, in the libraries of the Vatican. But of course, that is the story of Aristotle in the Middle Ages, and Plato was banned, and most of your ancient Greek writings and Roman writings, for that matter, were not in Western Europe. They did, though, survive in Eastern, that is, in the Byzantium Empire, and they also survived in the Islamic communities outside of the Mediterranean area. Um, Anyways, over time, right, in the Middle Ages, through the plague and through other factors, the Christian church sort of fell or lost a lot of its power. New Christian religions were formed, like the Protestant religions, and all of these texts from Byzantium started to roll into Western Europe. A long story short, the Renaissance is defined by a reintroduction to the West of Plato and non-theological Aristotle and a whole slew of other ancient writings, including medicine, philosophy, literature, you name it. Right. So in the Renaissance time, all the kings and the elites, especially the Italian elites, they started to embrace Platonism and Neoplatonism because that was subversive. And that sort of got philosophy back into the West. Over time, all of this ancient Greek and Roman literature and philosophy would start to change the face of Europe, and we reach an era of enlightenment where the medieval Aristotle is officially rejected, and you get what you call the beginning of modern day science. This is a very different Europe. This is a post-Middle Ages, post-Renaissance Europe. You have actual universities that study secular topics, and of course, the world had been in a dark age. Of course, we're not talking about China or India. We're talking about Europe had undergone the dark age. And in the Enlightenment, the money from the kings starts to flow to these scholars who start to make great innovations. This is applied philosophy. People that could harness the science could invent steam engines, right? Or all sorts of devices, learn how to truly harness nature. And so, for the most part, Aristotle and Plato were completely re-embraced in different ways. We could think of the writings of Descartes and Kant and ultimately Newton. Um, that used these frameworks, but then made that additional step forward and produced scientific truth, scientific validity, and a system for checking and balancing and finding reduplicable results. Having said all of that, today, as we study Plato and Aristotle, their questions still are hard to answer. Plato's questions nearly impossible. Aristotle, a lot of his things have been codified and turned into science, but even Aristotle's questions are not easy to answer. So both philosophers still have a massive influence on the modern day world as thinkers alike, be it scientific or medical, academic, philosophical, read Plato and Aristotle and try and push the limits of what we know. What are the limits of what we know? And what kind of system can bring us to the next level of truth? So these guys were very influential. That's all I have today. See you in the next lecture.